right, hello and welcome everybody. This is the weekly Antelope Node Operators Roundtable. Today is December 6th, 2023, getting close to the new year and excited about kicking off 2024 in the EOS and Antelope communities. We will be discussing updates on LEAP 5.0 release candidate 3. We're going to cover a sort of just community-led discussion on documentation improvement. And also I've got, related to that, a special topic that I'll save for the end. So let's get right into it. Update on 5.0 RC3. So as I've mentioned before, we've had like a couple of items that were still outstanding that were kind of we were holding 5.0 for. Those are at this point finished with one failing test. So we're really close on it. We were hoping actually to push today. We believe that, assuming that looking into the test doesn't uncover something that unforeseen, we believe that we'll be able to just push it a single day. So 5.0 RC3 will likely be available tomorrow by end of day. That's the goal right now. I'll let you guys know in Telegram if anything changes there. Just as a quick recap on what actually is in the release candidate 3. So of course, we've covered 5.0 in the past. So I won't recap all of that. It of course has everything that the RC2 has. It also has some bug fixes and some performance improvements. Specifically, there's some performance improvements that further tune the new like memory mode features that we rolled out with 5.0 RC2, and further improve the chain base memory optimization stuff. And then of course the other items are just operational improvements around our build process, including a reproducible build, and which is going to enable us to do signed builds moving forward. So starting at least with the stable release, we will be releasing signed binaries. We're going to experiment with that manually on release candidate 3, but we're not viewing it as a blocker. So there may be signed binaries for release candidate 3. I'll keep you updated and apprised on that. And then of course there's tests, test stability fixes and things like that. So for the most part, if you have used release candidate 2, you should expect release candidate 3 to be functionally equivalent, but just a little bit more stable and sort of fine-tuned. So that's it on RC3 and what's in it. Again, our plan is to push that tomorrow, which would be December 7th. As far as the stable release, obviously we don't know what the community might uncover in release candidate 3. However, the information we do have is the efforts that have been put into testing release candidate 2 so far. And for that matter, EOS Nation in particular has effectively been running release candidate 3 on non-block producing nodes for quite a while now. They didn't get like an early version or anything like that. They just were building from the latest version of the 5.0 release branch, and that's why I say effectively have been running on release candidate 3. So we do have some information there, and we don't foresee any nobody ever foresees unforeseen issues, but that's what I was about to say. So, and then as far as stable, assuming no unforeseen issues, the goal is the first week in January is when we would promote to stable. So we just do the version bump and officially mark it as latest release, and include a signed binary, and that would be the first week in January. In the, so just in the interest of giving us some flex in case of, because coming off the holidays, there can be some just unexpected logistic stuff. In the interest of giving us some flex, I would say that we can confidently state that within the first couple of weeks in January, we should see a stable, assuming that there are no issues uncovered with release candidate 3. And to that end, just another call that once we make release candidate 3 available tomorrow, which really means, by end of day. So we're really talking like Friday for most folks. The call for folks to go ahead and install that and put it through its paces so that we can, so that we're actually able to get some community testing sort of value out of having that release candidate available between now and the new year when we would promote to stable. And just to reiterate why we're waiting until after the new year, originally we had thought about, because we've had testing on release candidate 2 for a while now, we thought about doing a pretty short period between RC3 and stable, like a week, for example. Ultimately, what we realized is that because we don't anticipate any difference between release candidate 3 and stable, really the difference is us effectively stamping it and saying we're ready to support this. And we also realized that with most of the folks who would be supporting it in the US and subject to US holidays, it might be foolish to to mark something as stable and say, yep, we're good and ready to support this, right as much of the folks who would be supporting it might be unavailable. So really it's just a practical thing, is why we're waiting until after the new year. But it should be available as stable within the first half of January. All right, that's my update on 5.0. Any questions or commentary around 5.0 before we move into a discussion on documentation? Excellent. All right, so the illustrious Michael of EOS USA has recommended the topic of discussion. So I'm going to allow him to kick off the discussion and kind of present, where his interest lies there, and open the floor for conversation on documentation for LEAP. Michael?
Sure. Thank you. So really it comes from a community, I don't know, question, whatever, that they were trying to spin up, I think, an EOS node, and ran out of space, or were running out of space, something like that. And we're asking about log splitting, striding, whatever you want to call it. And where's the documentation? Well, I mean, there's a few pieces here and there, but when I just went kind of digging through, I didn't go through docs., which may have some information about it, but it was the question about going from 3 to 5. That was really the question about jumping version 4, right? There was no consensus upgrade, so most people haven't. Well, if 5.0 is coming out, any concern, any compatibility, anything like that, which no, for the most part, everything probably would go smoothly. The problem, which has always been, is when you get those gaps, and even if you don't pick off the right version to read the notes of, it's very hard to figure out what did I miss, where's that information. So the block striding is in like the 4.0.0 release notes, that, hey, by the way, this changed and here's kind of how it works, right? I mean, those release notes did a great job on a lot of the new features of really chunking them out. But if you don't know, and I mean, even me, I knew they were in there somewhere, and I was digging through, going backwards. The farther down those release notes got, the more you had to know to go and look for 4.0.0, because obviously 404 shot to the top, and 3.2.4 was next. And so, I've always talked about and I have the preliminary of like an upgrade matrix for that reason, to be able to say, if you go from here to here, what are all the things that I need to know? Obviously, it's going to nuke itself whenever you go to start with the old CPU block production settings, right? And people are going to comment that out and rock and roll. Now, luckily, the new settings are much more friendly to what they need to be, but like we saw with 4.0, people rolled over to it, missed in the release notes that lovely little EOS USA feature of resource monitoring. And fun fact, I even had one shut down 2 days ago because it hit 90% free space, and I forgot that it didn't have the override in it. So just kind of bringing to light, 5 is now kind of getting lined up as an optional upgrade, right? Performance, if you need it, features, whatever. 4.0's got those endpoints that really help. And now 6.0 relatively soon, which probably will be a more consensus driving. But now you're going to have people going from 3 to 6 potentially, right? And there's going to be a hell of a lot of change, even if you're running 3.2. So just bringing that back up.
So can I try to summarize to make sure I'm understanding the point here? It sounds like what you're saying is release notes. Obviously, everything could always be improved, but like the information is in the release notes. But if you're jumping, one or more versions, the detailed feature documentation is not available in like a comprehensive format for node operator like needs, right? And that might cause issues, especially in a situation where somebody's jumping several versions to 6.0, which will be a consensus upgrade. Am I understanding that right?
Correct. It leads to the, if you know, and everybody else learns the hard way, ask the question whenever it blows up. And then, oh yeah, by the way, we lived through that a year and a half ago.
Yeah, I wonder if practically, so obviously there's the ideal goal of like every feature being, thoroughly documented in a comprehensive way, right? Even if we did that though, then there's the potential of it be like the detail you need being lost in like a sea of information, right?
Correct. And like I say, I
wonder
mean, the docs are more like, almost a manual, which I think, I don't know, Nathan that does all that. I found some good summaries of it. But like I say, I
yeah,
mean, if you've got the old and the new, are they stacked up side by side? I mean, how do you really know?
yeah,
And there's so much that has changed.
right. Yeah, so I'm wondering if is there a practical subset of I don't know how to express this thought, of items that need to be documented for somebody who's making that jump, that where we can predict what they would need? Or is it more that like it's going to be so case by case that you just need the comprehensive, you know what I'm saying?
It's not an either or, obviously. You have to have the comprehensive just from the pure technical level, right? Which, I mean, I think y'all have done a much better job than it used to be, right? We can just get the nomenclature and the units of measure squared away. But anyway, I I don't know the magic answer. Like I say, the one thing I kind of came up with was a matrix of here's all the stuff that we figured out. And it's really been hitting up VPs, and those of us that know are because we bang our head against it, run into an issue. We were here on the calls when it got developed. We know why it's there. You know, I mean, there's things that I know are there and I haven't even played with yet, right? So after you're 2 years into a release, we end up with these configs that have pretty consistently kind of replicated their way out through, here, do this, or, oh, that's what does that, right? So we kind of find that happy medium as we go. But it gets lost, and it's so painful. It's almost like tears, right? You got those of us that are just breaking shit all the time and know it, and then forget it and have it in our configs when we copy it. Then somebody else says, hey, what the hell does this mean? Oh yeah. And then there's those that aren't really connected with us, right? I mean, they're not in a BP channel to be like, what happened? So those are the ones, and they're the ones that jump even farther. They've been running 3.1. You know why? Because it works. And then eventually they're going to get pushed to 6. And a lot of ain't going to work, or works differently.
Anyone else have thoughts that they want to contribute?
I guess I'll say that comparing Antelope docs to other blockchains, you're doing an excellent job, even with the current set of comments.
Yeah, don't let that be a bad tarnish. It's so much better than it used to be. It's just so confusing. But unlike a lot of other blockchain nodes, this ain't an ETH node that you just spin up and it does it, right? I mean, you really have to understand if you want to operate it. I mean, you can run it, but it's got all those knobs and parameters and features because they kind of got to be turned.
Well, I mean, I was reading discussion for one other blockchain. Yeah, that feature exists. We don't test it. You shouldn't use it. We don't document it, but the command line is there. That was the official response from development. Okay, I think this team does a better job than that.
Although I'll go back to saying, why can't I run OC? Isn't it enabled? No. Don't do that. Don't do that. Why? Well, just because you don't. Now that's much better. But yes, it's just I see it coming. You know, I mean, and it happened on the last hops, and just bringing it back up. But now that we're not screaming 90,000 miles an hour towards a, you know, instant release, you know, I mean, we've got time, we're methodically getting into it. I just bring that point up because it already started. They're looking at Matthew was in the channel. What's different? Oh, a whole lot. Where do I see that? And a shitload of release notes.
Even with good documentation, there's just a set of users who will never read that and just complain.
I agree. Not everybody RTFs. I don't even RTF in, but that's why I say in some sort of a structure that's at least easier to consume than all inclusive and cumulative. You know, because it changes. I mean, the way it works actually may be a little different than when the original release notes described it. Well, shit, you got to read them both to know that.
And like synthesized to, yeah, I get that. As a sort of a thought exercise, do a little role play here. Imagine that you're somebody who's not super dialed in, but you do run a node, so you're not like clueless or anything like that. You do run a node, but you haven't been upgrading. You're running, you know, I don't know, 3.1, for example, right? And now you're upgrading to 6.0, for the consensus upgrade. You know, ignoring like what might be in 6.0 that you don't know how it's going to work yet, ignoring that part. What are the sticking points, the gotchas that you think like people might bump up against commonly?
That a question to me, or does anybody else want to chime in?
Yeah, it's open. Anybody who has some thoughts there.
I guess I have a few. It's hard, right? There's case by case, role by role, Matthew level of tech ops, you know. But for the most part, those are those standard configs that kind of get passed around, either at a chain level recommendation and guides from EOSphere, you know, I mean, different things that kind of percolate their way out that y'all have at least started providing some better defaults and recommendations, right? I remember when those weird windows and limits came out, it was like, well, you might consider something like this. You know, it's much better to have some recommended settings, or at least defaults that aren't crazy. But I mean, it's really, my config files don't have more than probably 30 lines setting different things, right? I mean, there's how many parameters in Node OS? 150, right? I mean, not all of them really matter unless you need to know. But
Yep.
You know, knowing the roles, you know, we had kind of gotten into the definition of the roles. That's how I found, in at least my kind of, you know, proof of concept matrix, was to group them, and that way you could, and that's why we did that discovery during those weeks.
Yep.
Was to try to identify, what are you trying to do? You don't care about block production. You would think, hey, it's important that I match. Nope, you don't matter. You know, only reason you got it is because you want to do snapshots. Yeah, I know it doesn't make sense, but different thing. Grouping some of the most common. Go ahead, Chad.
Yeah, I just think it depends on the user. Here you're talking about like somebody who's running a node or wants to run a node, but not very technical. I think just simple guides about, okay, you want to just join a public chain. Here is a simple way to configure it. And here are the general requirements for the most popular chains. If you want to run a node for history, here's how you configure it. You want to run your own chain to test smart contracts or other things. Here is kind of a step-by-step guide how you can do that with some like default configs. I think that would be like get everybody started, and links to, of course, read more about any specifics or changes once they get more comfortable.
Correct. For instance, like, oh, go ahead.
Just one of the things that we had talked about, and so I'm not saying this because it's already underway or there's been much weight put to this. It's just, this is a brain fart. But one of the ideas, the majority of the people that are running nodes actually really don't give a shit about running the node. They need to run a node, or they just need, like, the majority of stakeholders are not at the same level as, for example, the people on this call, where they need to configure everything and network security is into play. Having some kind of executable file, double click, you're good. You don't need to choose parameters. You don't need to do anything. It automatically updates. There's a new release. It actually auto upgrades. The majority of people are there. The majority of people are not on the side of having to configure everything. So that comes into play, even for example, some of the exchanges. Not talking about the exchanges near the top 21 or those that are, you know, that have a lot of traffic, but we've got 180, 190 different exchanges that are synced to the network. I'm pretty sure exchange 190, 189, 188, and so forth, they really don't care very much. And so if you have some type of double click, it auto updates, it just runs and it's fine. The majority of the people would be good with that. The majority of people deploying applications would be good with that. And then once you get kind of as once whatever you're running has either more weight into it, or there's more money involved, then you might actually justify spending the time to be able to configure everything, or now you want control over security more than you did. But right now, everything is fully customizable, and the person, 190 on the other end, or the person who just wants to play around with EOS, it's too high of a barrier. So we only have expert mode. We really don't have easy mode. So having something like that could be interesting as well, where you actually don't need to read the manual because you don't care about reading the manual. You don't want to read the manual. You actually don't care about how the node runs. You're good with that. We don't have that option right now. So having something like that, instead of actually providing more documentation, is probably a higher ROI at this point.
I would agree. I mean,
But that would
what I
have to be
will
outside the.
go ahead.
Well, where's the official Docker image?
Well, that's what I was gonna say was what tends to work is, standard config.inis. I'll say, we run all the chains. I use the same settings across them all, right? I mean, I
I'm
could
going
probably
even one step further, Michael. You don't even know what the settings are because you really don't care.
I do now,
Because it's
but you're
irrelevant.
absolutely
I'm not
right.
talking about you. I'm talking
Correct.
about there's a lot of stakeholders out there where this is irrelevant.
We are speaking the same language. I agree. What I was just clarifying is, Shaka kind of said per chain, and I'm like, to be honest, because as a global entity, yes, we're on EOS, but there's other chains or whatever. I really don't find that they vary that much because it's more based off of the role. Is it an API? Here's the standard configs that I use on all of them. Plus, now you've got these additional. It used to do everything, just flip it on. Now you've got to add in all these extra parameters to do the transaction push to and transaction retry status. I do think that either A, you could provide a default config INI, and if it was rolled into the Docker, that might work just as easy. Because I mean, if you really want to see the config INI, fine, go to the GitHub and get it, or be able to pull it into an API Docker image that does that. Taking it a step further, and I think it's like what Matthew does is, I mean, there's deployments and automation. I think that he says, I want it to be this kind of a node, and it says, cool, let me build that for you, because it's kind of got that repo of all the shit that just needs to be there. You could build that in.
Providing that at the network level, where you don't know, you don't care because it's irrelevant for you right now.
Do you think it needs to be at the network
people
level?
that do know and that do care?
We agree,
and that
100%.
It's auto updatable. That they install 3.1, and when 3.2 comes out or 5.0 comes out, it auto updates. They don't even need to know that there was an update. It's irrelevant for them. The majority of stakeholders are in that boat. Now, the people in this call, completely different. You're running nodes because you're trying to secure the network, but you are the 1 out of 100.
I guess I'm speaking more from like a DApp, which is a hybrid in the middle, but probably closer to your side of it, right? I mean, they don't care about.
It depends on the DApp. Does the DApp have $5 in it, or does it have $100 million? $100 million.
I agree. There's more of an edge.
$5 in it. They don't even have the staff to be able to do what you guys.
We're saying the same thing. I agree 110% with you on a lot of that, but those are exactly some of the stances. Because we end up fielding the questions when they do happen to stumble their way in, when something finally breaks or they finally get somebody to look at it. So
this one,
I agree,
because it would work on its own, just like Windows right now works on its own for me, and I don't need to worry about it. There's a new patch, it just updates on its own. There's an issue that was discovered by you guys on this call, it updates on its own. They don't have issues because it just works.
What Eva's talking about is not
right
just a standard config or something like that. It's talking more about like a Node EOS manager, kind of like how Diffuse had one with limited functionality, which can auto restore from snapshots, delete your state data. But this will go further. It will run like as a service that can manage your node, and then it can connect to a community update site that will auto fetch you, say, for example, the common networks, their peer addresses, as well as monitor any critical updates. And then it will manage the node for you. So it will shut it down gracefully. It will restart it. And it can ask you your timings, your schedule when you want to do that. It could be very easy to do, like a very easy user experience. and nothing is it's just a matter of work. There's nothing complicated about it.
Yeah, we don't have any of this. I'm not suggesting something we already have. This is a completely new, different thing, which would likely apply to the majority of people. The majority of people are just trying to test out. Right now, if you've got $5, you've got an idea, it's too complicated. You don't have enough time, you don't have enough money. And so you kind of, the bar or the barrier to entry is way too high. Taking that barrier to entry and almost putting it to 0, where you double click a file and you're now running. Something as simple as that.
The idea of a separate piece of software that's doing the configuration and upgrades for you is certainly appealing to me. Matthew, I mean, you mentioned a standard Docker image. From your perspective, what would be sort of the benefits and disadvantages of that versus like a node manager piece of software, or do you just view them as solving different problems?
Somewhat the same, somewhat different. If you look at Google, you know, any of the other, you know, not Ethereum big chain, but all the smaller chains, they all have Docker images. If you go on their website, how do you install? Docker install blah blah blah, 2 commands, your thing's up and running. Right? Download snapshot from here, do this. Right? So we have a big barrier to entry where, oh, well, download a deb file. Okay, now configure whatever. Right? So like the steps are different compared to other blockchains. Now in our team, we take those Docker compose files and we go, well, let's undo all that and figure out how it runs so we, you know, understand it. Yeah. But to Eve's point, the standard use case is, well, there's a Docker image, right? And so I've worked with some of the exchanges in EOS and they're like, well, I need to build a Docker image because our standard is Docker and, you know, there's not one provided. So, and of course, Docker images with a config.ini out of the box that has the right configuration that most people need.
I think a node manager can do that already. Like having a node manager can already do that, and you can have a very simple, you know, virtualization or like a system on top of it that could be coded easily, could be very simple. But this enables both things. You could run it on bare as well as on, like, you know, cloud solutions. So I think it will achieve both without having to maintain 2 different versions.
Yeah, I mean, other blockchains like Cosmos has this thing called Cosmovisor, which, you know, when there's a new binary that's required, it updates it for you. Now, it doesn't always work, but, you know, it's like there's a consensus hard fork coming. The hard fork version and block is on chain. The Cosmos Visor knows when the block is coming, it stops your node and restarts it and it keeps going. So ideally, you could automate that whole thing and not do anything. Now, of course, the validators should not do that. The validators should verify factories.
Yes, that's different.
But the exchanges should let it run.
So my point for bringing this up is pretty much every time I join this call, to me, as a third party, not joining this call all the time and not running nodes personally, it sounds like the majority of your time spent is to make the expert mode even more expert. Let's make it even more expert. Let's go down the rabbit hole even further so that less people can actually understand this shit. And what I'm saying is we've gone that far. Like if you stop doing this today, like Matthew was kind of saying, the amount of documentation that's there is good for the majority of use cases and people at this point. If you need more, it's because you're really down the rabbit hole, completely different. And then you need your hand holding and now you're actually pushing the barrier. For the majority of people, we've not taken care of the other side of things, which is, I don't need the expert mode. I don't need to know how all this stuff works. Actually, it's already too complicated for me. There are 1,000 different parameters. I don't need to know. Tell me which chip to buy, because I just want to buy the chip and like, I don't care. I just want to eat chips today. We don't have that right now. And so a lot of the ROI, I think at this point of taking what we have currently and making it a little bit more expert mode, a little bit expert more, the ROI is incrementally smaller and smaller and smaller and touches less and less people. And we're further and further away from a lot of people that could benefit from something very simple, like Shaq and Matthew are essentially suggesting. And then the people, though, that would determine what goes in that easy mode are the people that are in this call that actually can figure out what would be the automatic configs, what would work well, because you've done all of that work. And I think you do at this point have the knowledge and the experience to know what that would look like.
Right. On the Docker versus node manager sort of detail, I'm curious if we had a piece of software that managed nodes automatically, would the standard Docker image still have value, and vice versa? If we had the standard Docker image, would a piece of node software, a piece of software that managed nodes for you automatically have value? Does that make sense?
To address the last one, yeah. To address the last part, yes. Even if you have a Docker image, you might still want to run it on bare machine because for whatever reason you want to use more performance, or you're running in a virtualization environment that doesn't support Docker for some reason. So, but the other way around, the node manager can be part of the Docker script or the Docker file. Like, if you know that, like when you set up your Docker, you can use that tool to automate everything, and then you have one place to, like, one thing to maintain. The Docker image, like, almost will never change, and then that tool will always fetch the latest, like, stable version. Have this ideally like a system that connects to like community provided configs, and then people can just automate everything, whether setting up like a heavy machine with recommendation, because this binary can read, of course, the system performance and what it's able to do, and provide recommendations of what can it run history, can it run diffuse, can it run this, based on what is the recommended that is supplied by part of that like community config or option.
I might suggest that, like, that sounds like a V2 because that's pretty feature enhanced. Awesome, cool things about it, but you know, I mean, that's a whole service application. I think even a first good step, especially because of the way NodeOS and its config files work, would even just simply be a script that, you know, says, what are you trying to set up? An API or a state history or whatever, you know, maybe a few of the, because then you can just go and pull, check the latest version, check the default configs. I agree there are some things that are chain specific, but for the most part, at least what I'm talking about, and in relation to what Eves, I think we're saying the same thing. We need it to be easier. And I mean, we can develop the whole EOS.
No, but he means like they don't need to keep up with even the peer address changing and updating their peers. And so it's basically, that's the idea of having also
totally get it. A management service
and get that info.
I agree. And that would be awesome. But at least from the world of development, that's a whole additional project.
It's not that much. Like once you do the first part of it, like if you go down the route of making a node manager, adding things like that is not complicated, really. It's not the time consuming thing, especially provided by community.
If you did it like a startup script or manually initiated to start with, you could almost replicate what several people have built, either Matthew or I know Detroit Ledger. They have a bunch of Ansible scripts and stuff like that. Graymass actually pulls Docker and has default Docker INI images just like that. I mean, they're almost doing exactly that concept. So I get it, and I totally support something to automate it, run as a service, check it, configure it, show it love, do whatever it's got to do. But I don't think you're going to be there right now. But you could probably break down that burden sooner rather than later, even with like a simple config generator type of thing, right? In my opinion, that you could pull from default INIs in the
like it doesn't all have to be built at the same time. It's just making sure that the decision of where to go can accommodate, like when we talk about these other features, is to make like the good choices at the beginning that could accommodate all this expansion. But even that simple first version, if it's running like something you can install and runs as a service, for example, and just manages with, you know, like the manager itself gets updated over time with more options, I think that would be a better start than a script that would be more limited in how it can run and require the user to configure all types of things in their system.
Mhm.
And where I'm coming from as well is from an EOS point of view. So if Telos or Wax or UX or other Antelope iterations want to do their own thing, that's fine. So I'm not suggesting as well that somehow the foundation takes care of every chain and does this for everybody. This is it's very much a selfish, from an EOS point of view, for the EOS network, especially if we're the ones funding this and managing this, right? Now I understand that you are all running on multiple chains, but you're probably not the one using the service. This service is for people outside of the people here, pretty much. Now, whatever is built can then be adapted to other chains. Then, like Shaq was saying, if you build the foundations properly, it's irrelevant afterwards.
Right, you just have a standard of the data like that like could be fed into it. You can have configs with, you know, links for snapshot links for whatever it is, or snapshot like servers, and you can literally have everything. Like it should be abstracted that it doesn't matter the underlying chain. Same with the diffuse manager. It doesn't matter what chain is running under it. As long as it's Antelope, I can manage it. I can restore from snapshots. I can configure it under different roles.
And people also would not, you would need to determine which services are needed. So I imagine, so you could take kind of the example that I gave of exchange number 190 on 190. What do they need? And or, all right, from an application that's just deploying, that's got $5 and just wants to toy around, what do they need? And so you wouldn't have 30 different services that those people need. It's likely very, very simple, pretty basic, but now you'd be able to cover maybe 80%, 90% of the stakeholders. And you'd be reducing that barrier for a significant amount of people. So the ROI would be incredibly high. Then you'd be able to see, does this have traction? Are people actually using this? Do people care about this? And then you could invest more time and resources in fine tweaking it, adding functions, going to different types of stakeholders. You start pretty basic.
And it could be very easy because a lot of them would want redundancy if they're connecting to their own nodes. So it's just like, here, you have this manager, install it in your VM or install it in whatever machine, run a few of them, and then they're all familiar with admin tasks like running a reverse proxy or something to load balance or any of that kind of stuff. So what they don't know is the EOS part or the Antelope part. So you just automate that, and then it's a service that's providing like a port to you. And I think it should be good for the beginner as well as the advanced user, like eventually.
And again, kind of the idea here is we're talking about documentation and going further down the rabbit hole versus spending that same time and just maybe being able to reach out to a far greater amount of people than adding one more document.
The documents I'm talking about have that in game in mind. I'm not trying to add any more complex documentation. I'm saying it's too complex and too disparate. What I'm trying to do is come up with something that if you do need to do it, it's more easier to digest and pruned to what matters, right? To you. So
what matters to most people, you even said it, you don't even read the manual. Imagine the person on this call doesn't read the manual. Imagine the majority of people, they really don't care. They just want to sync to the network.
The majority of people that I talk to that are running a node don't care nearly as much as me. You're absolutely right. But what I've done, and that's what you've talked about, people on this call, work with it, figure it out. Look, this is the shit that you need. These are the settings that work. Either we figured it out or learned it from somebody else, whatever. And this is what's changed. So the difference between here and there, what's an easier way of disseminating that? I agree doing it all automatic.
You abstract it completely. You don't tell them what the changes are because they don't care.
Yeah, I was going to say, actually, funny enough, I think explaining.
Don't do any more documentation and spend all of our time developing this management software. I'm trying to solve some solutions more shorter term, but I agree with you in the long run. But the documentation I'm talking about is to make it easier versus diving into the rabbit hole of the crazy configurations. That's
by the way, managing software, like if somebody's familiar, it's probably like a few days they can get a prototype. It's not like some massive thing. Like you're not building the underlying software, you're controlling. You're literally
You're
doing the
telling me that
equivalent
we've
of
lived
running
in
some
this world
scripts
for
on it. You know?
7 years of this
Well-
manual pile of poop, and it would have taken somebody 3 days to figure this shit out?
Well, Michael,
No,
I'll
make
say,
a group of
Michael.
mindset.
I'm just
Mark-
suggesting
I get it,
a
I get it.
perhaps different path that we've never entertained, that we've never gone down, that we've essentially put aside for a very long time. I'm not saying you stop doing documentation. I'm not saying everything that's been done is garbage. I'm saying we've neglected this easy part and we've focused on the expert part, and we've just gone down even further with the expert part, which is quite relevant for network security. But at this point, even if you stop doing this for a period of time, you're so far ahead, you're probably good. You probably have leeway. You probably have time to focus on something else. And like Shaq was saying, you're not reinventing the wheel. You're actually taking the 7 years worth of experience you've gotten so that you're able to condense it in a 3-day thing because you've gone through the pile of shit for 7 years. And obviously it won't be as simple as that. You're going to encounter issues there. It's not going to work as easy, but it is an untapped opportunity, I think, compared to keep going down this way, that I think is worth it.
It was much harder. And it was much harder to do it before because, you know, there was a lot of major upgrades and a lot of things changed over time. Now it's actually, I think it's an easier task if you're supporting, you know, say Leap 4 onwards for that tool.
yeah, counterintuitively too, the software, assuming we keep it simple and don't go crazy with it, the software might actually be easier to manage than documentation. And the reason I say that is software breaks when it's out of date. And documentation just festers if it's out of date, you know. So anyway.
And maybe this is complete garbage. This is also possible that this idea is complete garbage, it's not gonna work out. I've just never heard it talked on this call.
I love the idea, and part of it's the same thing we were trying to do, is identify the roles. I think that the easiest way to break that down and provide it is you have to ask something, what are you trying to do? And then the way Node OS is built, you can at least provide the default configs with default settings that we've figured out are the best thing. I agree that a management solution and software and what Ubuntu does it support, what all build libraries does it have, what all you know what I look at? I know because I trained a minion to do it. When you need to build a node, it's an API, a peer-to-peer, which is just a sync, a state history, a block producer, or a snapshot node. He's just copying and pasting a couple of lines of code when it really comes down to it. That would go a long way in, number one, identifying, well, because we get hung up on this, what are the default settings? What are the recommended ones? Well, this one does this, and this one does that, and this one does that. I agree, we need to get rid of all of that and come up with the standard options for the roles, and that in itself
You could almost assume that they're going to be running this on AWS.
That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about enabling, if you're going to run an API, like most of the people I talk to are running an API because they run a DApp or for whatever reason need to just talk to the normal native chain API data, right? But they don't realize now that if you just flip it on and use the default settings, you don't get the transaction status endpoint. You don't get the account queries lookup. You don't get the retry endpoints or any of that because they just aren't on by default. But on an API, pretty much everybody's figuring out, well, shit, you probably should run these if you're running an API, but they're optional. It's not even as easy as it used to be. When it was on, it was on. When it was off, it's off. Now you've got all these little switches that go along with it, which really are just config parameters.
Right, that's more an argument for the tool, actually, like the manager. Because like the way I see a manager is you're running a service that what it does is it runs a web server that's hosting on a certain port. That way, because obviously a lot of times you're going to install it in a headless machine. So you want to be able to access that configuration site. And that allows you to add anything you want. You click on it, there is default options. You click on the feature, like you check box next to a feature, it adds the stuff to the config. You can always see the final config. Like something like that is, I think it's not very difficult to do, as in terms of, you know, you don't have to invent something new. It's just using existing stuff like or knowledge, and will go a long way even for more technical users. It will just be an easier path, and they can make sure if it's connected to the same service that is running, that is maintaining, say, the documentation, that way they can be synced. That way, you know, like how to enable this feature, there's steps or there's certain config options that gets you kind of what you want, but that's the same source of truth that feeds into the configuration utility or the Node EOS manager. That way you have a good, like up-to-date experience on both of them while maintaining one source.
Totally for it. One note I'll say, we run piles of Node OS on the same box. So when you're developing and scoping that, think about how we've got potentially multiple, I mean, I run different versions. I don't know how far outside of the box you want to go, but it's not
This
just
product is likely not for you. Right? Like, you
he's
are
just saying it
unlikely to be
was.
the user of this. No, because you
He,
need that
not you,
maximum
not you. I agree.
configuration.
You're saying for the easy person. He's saying
But
it
I
would
don't-
work for the
I don't think
I
advanced
was
that's what
saying
Shaq
to an
said.
advanced user. I
Yeah.
didn't say one who wants to run custom multiple different
You're not an
versions of-
advanced user, Michael. You're like the developer of the software.
the breaker. So
And when we need to do that on even
you're breaker number one, yes. You're the official.
and even when we
QA,
need to do
QA.
custom stuff like this, it's gonna be custom at the end of the day. But for a lot of nodes that we run, we don't need to do any of that, and that software will fit right in. For example,
I don't know if that's what you were saying, Shaq, but almost like, I don't know what this looks like. You got a window that pops up. Hey, I need this function, this function, this function. You just click a box and then it configures for that, basically.
right? Kind of like, you know how Dune supports kind of multiple nodes and things of the sort, but instead of like using it on the command line, it's like the service is running a web server. So you really log into a site or like to, you know, in your local network, and you're able to configure like here, add a new node, and then you have options. What do you want it to be, API? And then the default options are checked. You can uncheck any of them. You can see the config update live if you want to, you know, double check everything is what you expect. And then if you want to connect to an existing chain, you know, if you want to put EOS's default or whatever, ability to add maybe some custom chains. And really that's it. I don't think it needs to be more complicated as a starting point. And I don't think it's a lot of work compared to what, you know, you guys are doing in like Leap.
Isn't it true though that like most people who would want this kind of automagic stuff, right? They likely just want to be able to get like read data off the chain with the lightest weight installation.
Then connect to public API.
Oh no, most of my people are those that the only reason they're running a node is because they work with the chain. They don't need Hyperion. They'll use public. They've are avoiding state history like the plague, but they need to run an API, and
yeah,
that they just want to. And a lot of them will spin up a Docker image and say, okay, run it on AWS and let her rip, right? And
yeah, I think
then,
for example, exchanges are an example though, Shaq, of where the, you know, connect to a public API isn't an answer that's likely to be accepted because
most of our public APIs on most bigger chains are rate limited. So I mean, when you really start getting rocking and rolling, I mean, even the nation's APIs will start throttling you back, and there's a limit because people abuse free services to the point that they're
if you want to run an API, which is the most common thing, it would just be the default option, right? You start your wizard.
That's exactly,
yeah.
I could imagine a first version of this not having any form of interface whatsoever. You just install it and run it, and now you have an API, and that's it. That's all you get. There are no options, you know.
I think you're going to have some options, but sure.
One of the things we talked about when we were talking about with the VPs and Michael on the VP call, when we were talking about when you're doing a hard fork, and then the risk of, you know, the work that is being borne by those people that have to actually update their nodes and such. And we're talking about very low stakeholders. I would try to focus this on that example of Exchange 190 that needs to stay in sync, but they can't justify the cost of staying in sync. And so you put that at risk every time you do an upgrade, versus with this, basically it's a set and forget. And like, that's the ideal customer that you're looking at essentially.
Yep.
It's the
So we
person
are
that needs to stay in sync, but they minimal cost, essentially minimal cost. And then you remove that
Yeah.
risk, because now it's no longer a risk. It auto updates for them.
All right. We are at time, so I'm just gonna sort of summarize the conversation as I sort of heard it. So basically, this all started from, you know, the anecdote of somebody trying to spin up an EOS node running out of space and not being able to find, you know, documentation on the solutions that are available to that. We talked about the fact that like most people who would want to run a node don't actually care about running a node. They're just trying to solve a problem in the most simplistic way possible, right? Solutions that we talked about all were centered around basically default and recommended configurations, but in different ways, right? One was like literally a default recommended configuration file. Another was, you know, a managing software that automatically configures and upgrades. Another was standard Docker images that automatically configures and upgrades. We talked about like basically easy mode binaries that would be for, you know, each chain or each role, those sorts of things. And the, you know, the sort of closing thought that Eve just shared is like solving for the person who needs to stay in sync at minimal cost and effort. So I appreciate everybody's engagement on the discussion. Really good stuff. And this is something that I will chase down as part of, you know, forward-looking roadmap. I think there is a lot of good stuff here. But I mentioned that I had like a silly topic. We are over time, so I'm going to save it for next week, assuming there's not a big meaty discussion next week. And this will become a running joke where I have this topic that we never get to, and yeah. Anyway, I'm going to build it up as something big. But anyway, thanks everyone for joining, and we'll see you soon.
All right, cheers. I'll make sure I'll join next week so you can't talk about it again.
I'm so glad you did. I love having conversations with you. We'll make it better.
Cheers, guys.